Who wrote this? I want to spend a couple minutes considering the question, how common is the practice of publishing articles under pseudonyms in creationist literature? This is just going to be a brief survey of a couple of examples. This is certainly not a scientific approach to this. I've not added up the numbers or anything like that. I was just curious about it because 2 days ago I came across an article on the Answers in Genesis website. That's a Young Earth Creationist ministry. And I was interested in the article because it's about whales, and I've published a little bit about whales, and I know that the story of whale origins is one of a lot of interest among evolutionary biologists, but it's also one that Young Earth Creationists talk about a lot. And so I saw that there was this new article. In fact, it's an Answers in Depth article on the Creation website. And so I thought, let's get in depth with that. But before I get in depth with anything, I want to know, what am I getting in depth? Who am I getting in depth with? And so I looked to see who the author is, and I saw Stephen Bartholomew Jr. And I thought, I've never heard of Stephen Bartholomew Jr. This is a first for me, and I am fairly familiar with Young Earth Creationist literature and the names that are commonly publishing, especially on this particular site. And so I clicked to find out who Stephen Bartholomew Jr. is, and I found out this is his first publication on the Answers in Genesis website. So, of course, I turned to our friend Google, and I asked Google, who is Stephen Bartholomew Jr.? And Google came back and said, gee, we don't know a whole lot of Stephen Bartholomew Jr.'s. There's a few from the 1800s and one that died in 1940, and there's Stephen Bartholomew that was on death row at one point. But as Stephen Bartholomew Jr., we've only got one real hit for you, and that hit is right here. There's a Stephen Bartholomew Jr. that wrote a book in 2012. At least I think it was 2012. I mean, Amazon for some reason calls the publication date January 1st, 1658. But I believe it's actually 2012, so that's 9 years ago. It seems conceivable that this is the same person because the topic is related to the topic that the publication on Answers in Genesis is. However, the fact I can only find this name here and no other information about this particular author here, only 4 reviews. I'm not going to read the book. It's $151 for me to buy. Obviously self-published. And so I suspect that this is a self-published book under an assumed name, right? A pseudonym. And therefore the name also on Answers in Genesis is being published underneath a pseudonym as well. All right, so I knew that this wasn't the only case of pseudonyms being used as authors on creationist sites. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with it. I'm not here to say that this is somehow wrong behavior on the part of the Answers in Genesis. I think there can be some consequences of doing that, which are not the best, and it's not the best practice. However, I don't have a problem with that happening once in a while, but the question is, does it happen quite a bit? And I'd say it actually happens a fair amount. I mean, I know of other situations where pseudonyms are used, and part of the reason for making this video is just to make you aware of the fact that many times you might be reading articles that are written under an assumed name. And that may or may not have any influence on what you think of that particular article. But it does allow for some things to happen. For one thing, it's a little bit hard to have communication with individuals. That not impossible necessarily, but makes it more difficult to maybe interact on if you think of it as a scientific enterprise and interacting with a person who's working under a pseudonym. I think there's also the difficulty of it can be a little bit easy for a person writing under a pseudonym to be maybe a little bolder in what they say, because there's going to be a lot less coming back to them directly in terms of being able to find out about them or their expertise. And one of the things I don't like also about some pseudonyms is many times there's no information about what their qualifications are to write that particular article. So from the perspective of Answers in Genesis, it gives off the image of a little bit less of professionalism. And I know that they are seeking a sort of professional look because in general they like to have PhDs working as their science advisors, and they always mention that they're a PhD or a doctor or so forth. So you can guarantee that if any author has a PhD, they're going to make you very aware of it. And so if they don't, you know that they don't have a PhD. Well, anyway, I started thinking about Stephen Bartholomew Jr. Of course, I was interested in like who that person is, really. But let's look at a couple others. And so just let me tell you about some other pseudonyms that I know about that have published quite a bit on the Answers in Genesis website. So here is, another reason I found I found this particular article interesting is because it was on whales. And I knew that there's another author who has written multiple papers on whales, who's also writing underneath the pseudonym. And so you might understand why I might initially think maybe these are the same individuals. And now they've taken on a new pseudonym or a new name for I don't know what reason. I kind of think that's not the case now, but I can't be sure. And part of the reason for that is because they're hiding under an assumed name, and so you can't be as certain of things as you might be otherwise. So here's Harry F. Sanders III, and I've heard Harry F. Sanders III be referred to many, many times. I think for maybe a year or two, I never suspected that this was a pseudonym until some recent events occurred in which I realized, absolutely, I know this is a pseudonym. He's writing along with Troy Lacey, who is an employee of the University of Answers in Genesis. And so another article in Answers in Depth. By the way, Answers in Depth is it's not a peer-reviewed thing. It's just a series of articles. They make it sound like they're part of Issues, but it's not really a journal. It's just sort of like longer articles than their usual articles. But in-depth doesn't necessarily mean it's been vetted any more than any other basic article that's on their site. So don't confuse that with even their version of peer review. It's something a little less than that. So Harry F. Sanders has written a lot of articles for Answers in Genesis, and a lot of them are in this in-depth category, which means that they have spent a considerable amount of effort to write these articles. There's a lot of information in some of these articles. So 58 articles over the period of a few years is a whole lot of writing. Now, I don't know if Harry F. Sanders is... I think it's one individual. The writing style seems to be similar, but I mean, it could be multiple individuals that all are using that same name. I don't know if it's a he or a she, but nonetheless, I think you should be aware that there's an enormous number of articles. That it's not just this. There's well over 100, but I would say possibly in the 150 to 250 articles that are probably written under assumed names, especially if you include John Woodmorap, which we're going to get to. So here's some other ones, and this one might be a little more obvious. Many of you might have picked up on the fact this is a pseudonym well before I did, because I had seen this name referenced, and Genomics, and I'm trying to say it so it's not as obvious, but if I say it more quickly, genomics, genomics. It's just a play on the word genomes, and this particular person writes articles that usually involve genomes. All right, and that's their area of expertise wherever they are in the world, the secular world. They're a genomicist of some sort, and they're writing under a pseudonym as they write for in young Earth creationist literature. Genomics has written 8 research articles for Answers in Genesis, and also written for some other creationist organizations or journals as well. And then there's John Woodmorap, probably the most famous of the authors writing underneath the pseudonym, who's essentially written an entire career's worth of material for Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, a bunch of independent creationist journals. John Woodmorap is got a master's degree. He says he has a master's degree, and he's most famous for writing this book, Noah's Ark. Where's my pen? Noah's Ark: A Feasibility Study, in which he looked at the dimensions of the Noah's Ark and then tried to determine how many animals could be fit on that particular ark. He had to deal with the whole question of what a kind is and so forth. So he's very important in that sense of sort of building an idea of what a kind is, and this would be 30 years ago now. And eventually many references to that particular book, and then he has gone on to write many articles that have followed up on that particular arc. So I'd say a very influential character within the young Earth creationist world, and yet writing all that material under a pseudonym. So fascinatingly, I had done a video 2 days ago which had a big error in it. That's why I'm redoing this video right now. And between then and now, I'd done some more searching, and I came across this particular article written by John Woodmarap. And at first I was kind of stunned by it. All right, I saw John Woodmarap. He wrote an article called "Pseudonyms: A Long Honorable Tradition," in which he writes about people using pseudonyms, and he's actually right. I mean, pseudonyms have been used by a wide number of different people, by many different people, for many different reasons. Just think of actors and actresses, actors and actresses using pseudonyms. But many other writers too, and many famous writers writing underneath pseudonyms. So there isn't necessarily anything wrong with it. I don't think that I am raising a hullabaloo about it, and I'm not here to make fun of creationists for using pseudonyms. I'm simply pointing out that they are being used. I actually thought when I saw this article that John was writing to me. And the reason I thought that is because I saw this date up here, March 14th, which is today, and I wrote this, I had made this video the day before. I thought maybe he saw the video and wrote this article. I was really kind of stunned by that. It was like kind of surprising it would be that fast. And then also the copyright 2021 right here. But as I started to look around this site, I realized that this date actually is on every single page. It's just an automatic date updater, and so it's always showing you the current date, not the date when this particular article was published. So probably not published in the last day, and not talking directly to me, but nonetheless, here is John Woodmarap writing under a pseudonym about the tradition of writing and using pseudonyms. Here's another one, and I'm familiar with Pierre Terborg, and I'm familiar with who he really is, what his real name is. Pierre Terborg is just a rearrangement of the letters of his real name, and he's used his real name and his pseudonym kind of interchangeably, and he's commented on my blog and so forth, and so I know who that is. Royal Truman actually has written many creationist articles, but also his name actually appears in the chemistry literature as well, secular literature as well. So I think Royal Truman is really Royal Truman. All right, so that's just a smattering of just a couple examples of individuals that are using pseudonyms in the young Earth creationist literature. And it's not just Answers in Genesis, but it's all across creationist literature, mostly for the reason that is explicitly said on this particular site, inhisimage.blog. It's a small blog that I follow by a creationist, young Earth creationist, who actually I'm saying it in the singular, but I think it's actually plural, in multiple people, although I think one is probably the main driver of this particular site, but it's a little hard to tell because due to a position I hold, I have chosen to use a pseudonym to prevent there being any possibility of confusion between my personal ideas and the company I work for. All right, so that disclaimer, and that's why he's chosen to use a pseudonym. He then talks about the pseudonym he uses, but then there's several other individuals that participate on the site, and it gets a little confusing as to who's writing what and who's responsible for what. And there's also videos with an individual, but it's hard to say who that individual actually is. It's confusing, right? And that's part of the problem of interchange of pseudonyms. And what makes this site particularly perplexing is the realization that articles that have been written for this particular site often will show up in some other form, or maybe the same form, on Answers in Genesis site, many times under the name Harry F. Sanders, who I just pointed out a few minutes ago, has written many articles for Answers in Genesis. And so it appears that someone on this site has written articles which then have been sent to Answers in Genesis, and they have published them, but under yet another name. Now, the problem with using lots of names is not only just the confusion of like, well, is this, how do I refer to this? All right, who's written what? And who do I give credit for if I'm going to reference someone's article? But I think there's also an additional problem here, and or it may not be a conscious thing that's being done, but when you proliferate names like that, it gives the audience, it gives people who might be looking at young Earth creationism and asking, like, how many young Earth creationists are out there? Well, it kind of looks like there's a lot of them. If there's a lot of people using pseudonyms, especially if there's people using pseudonyms and now are using their real names. So in the literature, you end up with more names than actually exist, more names than actually are people that are actually doing the work of young Earth creationist research and writing. And that, to me, is a bit of a false pretense, a false narrative. Now, I don't think this is a conscious thing. I just think it's a natural outcome of having used pseudonyms quite a bit. And so there are articles that by people using pseudonyms that reference other articles of other people using pseudonyms, and I'm not even sure if they're referencing themselves sometimes. Mostly, it's not a big deal. But I think it's interesting, and it's something to be aware of as you're looking at the literature. I'm just going to leave it there. That's my little spiel on pseudonyms in creationist literature. I'll just add that I know of there's several other prominent people in young Earth creationists that have also used pseudonyms at various times. And I've run across many other individual one-time articles that I've suspected are also pseudonyms. So I'm saying it's not an uncommon phenomenon. Is it like 5% of all articles, or is it 25% of all articles? I don't think it's anywhere near 25%. It's probably closer to 5% or maybe less. So it's not a like everything you read is written by somebody writing underneath the pseudonym. But there's enough of them out there that you're going to come across them. So I guess the last thing I'll say is that I'm not anonymous myself. My name's R. Joel Duff, and if you ever wonder what the R is for, that's my first name is Robert. I do have a doctorate from the University of Tennessee. It's in the Department of Botany, but it's really a molecular systemics is my area of specialty. I did a postdoc at Southern Illinois, worked on holoparasitic plants, which is why my interest in parasitic plants, working with genomes of those, specifically chloroplast genomes. And I have a bunch of other interests. I love Reformed theology. I play a lot of chess and run chess clubs, and got a bunch of kids, and I'm a biology professor. And it's important to know also that I have to say that the views expressed right here are not necessarily those of my employer. So University of Akron, I've said that. And I have a science and faith blog, so if you ever wanted to find out a lot more of what I think, I've written a lot of it down on thenaturalhistorian.com. And I love photography, taking pictures of nature, and I have a site called Portraits of Creation at beechnutphotography.com. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.